This is the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, a podcast brought to you by two physical therapists devoted to helping physical therapists and other healthcare providers become better educators to patients, students, the community, and each other by interviewing prominent and passionate people within the realms of healthcare and education. The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast is intended literally for educational and entertainment purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based on only one source, and therefore this podcast should not be used as personal medical advice. While care has been taken to ensure accuracy, occasionally mistakes and factual errors can be present, as we are only human. This is our journey on the road to becoming better educators, so get ready with your pen and paper as class is about to begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. My name is Brandon Powen, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, F. Scott Fiel. And today we have a special guest from Duke University. Tonight we welcome Dr. Derek Clewely, who is an assistant professor and core faculty member at Duke University Doctor of Physical Therapy Division, where he teaches the health promotion across the lifespan, musculoskeletal patient management, number 1 and number 2, and the sports elective classes. And Derek graduated from the University of Montana in 2002 with a master's degree in physical therapy, and later obtained his Doctor of Physical Therapy degree through Shenandoah University. In 2006, he achieved board certification as an orthopedic clinical specialist. He is an active member of the American Physical Therapy Association, and he graduated from Evidence in Motion's Manual Therapy Fellowship Program in 2010, part of the initial fellowship cohort. He is also a PhD candidate in orthopedic and sport sciences at Rocky Mountain University of Health Professions, and his primary research interests are health services, including health-seeking behavior's influence on utilization and outcomes. Derek has presented at numerous state and national conferences and has been published in peer-reviewed journals. He is additionally a faculty member with Evidence in Motion and the Benchmark Rehab Institute. He directed and developed the Benchmark Rehab Institute Orthopedic Residency Program and initiated the development of their Manual Therapy Fellowship Program. And last, of course not least, he's won a fair amount of awards, including the Physical Therapy Association of Georgia, the Merit Award for Exceptional Service and Achievement, Recognition of Excellence through Benchmark, Clinical Instructor of the Year from 2 separate universities, and also Clinician of the Year. So, Derek, that's a pretty impressive bio, man, and thank you for all your service and dedication to the profession through all that you've done. And, of course, I realize that I kept your bio pretty brief compared to all that you've done. But, is there anything that you'd like our listeners to know about you that I didn't mention in the intro here?
It's actually probably a little bit more than I maybe even deserve. It's kind of always interesting to hear your own bio about something and kind of reflect as it's being stated. So, yeah, I think probably the biggest thing for me in terms of my bio that I would probably add is, I did state that I was an active member of APTA and the American Academy of Manual Physical Therapy as well. And I think that those are very important in our profession. It's about establishing connections. That is what's really important. Currently, also, I guess I would add to my bio that I'm on the American Academy of Manual Physical Therapy board as the member at large. The American Academy of Manual Physical Therapy basically, of course, is the Association for Manual Physical Therapy. I've also served on a number of committees in the APTA, and I'm very proud of those things. I think that those are accomplishments that I think a lot of people can have early on in their career, and they should take advantage of those things. I was part of the annual conference programming committee for about 4 years, including chairing one of the conferences. So I think beyond that would be all that I would necessarily add. And I think it kind of, sort of transitions well to what we're talking about here and how I've grown as a clinician. But I think being involved in the associations and such is very important.
Yeah, Derek, I have to admit, being a Wake Forest guy, it's a bitter pill to swallow having a Duke guy on the podcast, but you aren't the first and you won't be the last. I have to admit, it's a very impressive bio, and you've really worked your way up through the various educational roles in the PT realm, and you're now a professor. What made you make the decision to pursue academia, and what are your plans for the future?
Well, I should probably clarify. Well, first of all, go Duke, so I'm sorry about that. We've got a lot of faculty members actually even within our program at Duke that are Wake Forest alums. So they've learned to drink the Duke Kool-Aid as well. But in terms of, I guess I should also clarify that I'm an assistant professor, which really puts me at the junior level faculty, which anybody that's interested in moving into a faculty position, that's a lot of times where you'll end up starting, depending on the structure that each university is set up to be in. So just want to clarify that I'm a very green faculty member. I think what really got me most interested in academia was right out of the bat as a clinician. So I started practice in 2002, and interestingly enough, I took my very first student probably a little bit too early in my career. Some would say, maybe I would actually probably say I don't think I was really quite ready to take on students, but because of a situation that we had in the clinic that I practiced in, I had to take a student, and I had probably less than 6 months of experience as a clinician, but right from there, I fell in love with actually teaching, especially in that one-on-one setting. So as a clinical instructor level, and actually within about, I think probably about 7 months after that, so maybe 13 months into my career, I took over as the CCCE, so the clinic coordinator for clinical education for a fairly large organization. So they saw, I guess, that I had that passion, and they were willing to give me that position, whether it was either because nobody else wanted it, or maybe they did find something in me that they knew that they would be okay to have that. But from then on, I really became very passionate about clinical education and being a clinical educator. I've, obviously in coming out of PT school and going into PT, I was most interested in clinical practice. And so I never really saw myself moving toward academia. In fact, I think I intentionally tried to swear it off because maybe subconsciously I felt myself gravitating toward that. But I think toward the last maybe 3 years before I actually moved officially into academia, I saw myself actually having much more of an interest in that realm. And part of it was because I was doing more teaching, either in postgraduate levels or also teaching at local universities. So I lived in Atlanta for a while, so I got an opportunity to teach some classes at Emory and Mercer and Georgia State and some other programs. So I kind of dabbled in that for a little bit. And then as my bio said, or I was mentioning in my bio, that the last sort of 2 or 3 years at my clinic time, I was involved with developing a residency and fellowship program, and really started to feel myself moving toward academia in terms of teaching went. And then in the other side of academia, of course, is research. After graduating from fellowship training, I realized that one, I had a very strong interest in research. I'm kind of one of those nerdy guys that I guess likes the whole research process. I enjoyed consuming it, but then I also recognized that I wanted to actually start to contribute to it. And so that's when I enrolled in a PhD program. And then as I was going through my PhD, really started realizing that if I wanted to actually really make an impact with research and do things, I probably really needed to move myself into a true academic environment. So I think that's a long story for how I became interested and then ended up in academia. And honestly, it was sort of on a whim. I started putting my name out there for some feelers for some positions, and I was very fortunate enough to obviously have a few opportunities where I could actually grow in a very healthy environment.
Awesome, man. And, and Derek, and first of all, congratulations with being, with facilitating the residency and the fellowship program with Benchmark. And the topic, of course, today that we're talking about is about residencies and, and about finding specifically the right residency program for the individual. But before we go into that, let's back up a little bit and start with this question. Derek, why should someone pursue a residency program in this day and age?
Yeah, I'm glad you actually said in this day and age. It's interesting because when I came out of PT school, which wasn't really that long ago, right? I don't think 15 years ago was that long ago, and I'm going to keep telling myself that. Even when I'm 30 years out of PT school, I'll keep telling myself that wasn't that long ago. But I think times have changed significantly from 2000, 2002 to where we're at now. For one, when I graduated, I know that I was coming out as a generalist. And really the emphasis was to be a generalist. And because, though, I think PT has expanded really at an exponential rate. And when I say that, I'm thinking not just in numbers of actual clinicians, which actually that is one of the things, but in terms of research in terms of recognition as a profession in the healthcare environment and where we can actually be in different places of practice and such, we start to become specialized quite early. And anybody that's graduated probably in the last, within the last 5 years, has sort of felt that push where you come out of PT school and then next thing you know, you're really becoming more of a specialist. That doesn't mean necessarily that one can't change. It's not hardwired like in medical school where, residencies are a requirement and then that's kind of where you are. But we're probably moving into that direction. And, so different from when I graduated, say 15 years ago, where certificate programs and these sorts of things were probably the biggest push, and maybe the ultimate certificate, of course, being board certification, like your OCS and sports certifications and other specialty area certifications. I think now we've established that there are ways that we can uptrain that beyond just being in the clinic and seeing patients. And the nice thing about residency, which is very different than any kind of certificate programs, is it's another opportunity to gain mentorship that you don't necessarily get in a typical certificate type program. I think the biggest reason, though, to pursue residency is, this is going to sound a little bit odd, but is to actually enjoy the profession more. And I know residency probably, there's probably tones of misery and I'm going to be up all night and working hard from not making a whole lot of money and et cetera, et cetera. But honestly, the folks that do residency gain clinical confidence and they gain that, I guess, ability to manage their patients better. And I think that actually brings joy to them as a professional. There's nothing more satisfying than gaining that appropriate confidence, especially early in your career. Beyond that, though, too, I think ultimately we are a profession that serves our patients. And to serve them better, I think that we have a responsibility to start to take full advantage of whatever opportunities there are out there to be even greater. That doesn't mean necessarily that I'm saying that if you're not doing that, you can't be great. But I think that if we have those opportunities, I think that's something that should be heavily considered. And at this point, especially as a new graduate or early graduate, a recent graduate, I should say, residency is sort of that top level early career catalyst push that one can actually take advantage of.
So, Derek, I've got to ask, as a seasoned clinician, I've been out 11 years now, and the way things went with my career, I wasn't really able to do a residency right out of college for many, many reasons, but, I'm not opposed to one now. What would be some advice you would give to a clinician that's been out there for 10 years or more, that's interested in maybe doing a residency or a fellowship?
Oh, that's a great question. So the short answer on that will be, I think it deserves absolute consideration. The residency is not necessarily, I guess in a sense, to some extent, it is intended for the graduate coming out of PT school. And I think 20 or 30 years from now, when we're all gray haired and whatever, residency will be for the new clinician graduating. But we've got a lot of really great people in our profession that will benefit from doing a residency or fellowship training. And so a couple of things that have to be considered in this. If you are a PT that's been out that does not have any board specialization, you have a couple of options there. You can, one, because of the amount of experience that you've had probably in that field or in that specialty, you can set up and apply to take the OCS, and obviously then take the OCS and self-study. And there's a lot of programs out there that you can leverage to help you with doing well on the OCS or other special board specialties, PCS, geriatric, those sorts of things. And then from there, I would suggest that the potential there would be that you could do a post-residency fellowship training. But that doesn't mean that if you are a seasoned clinician who's been out there for a long time, that a residency training program wouldn't be appropriate. In fact, the residency that we directed and the residency that I've been involved with, like evidence in motion and such, we've had clinicians who have had 10, 15, 20 years of experience who then went into doing a residency and then even actually transition residency after doing board specialization and doing fellowship training and such. So I think that there's a lot of options. If you have if you're a seasoned clinician who already has your board specialty, then I would actually recommend a fellowship program. There is actually, AbTree is moving toward, for any fellowship program, the requirement to have your board specialization. It's similar to the medical model where you go on and you gain a board specialty, which is a generalized specialty area, and then you do a subspecialty fellowship program. And so I think that is the big thing to consider there is where you're at. If you've got the specialty, go for the fellowship. If you don't have a specialty, then go into residency or set for your specialty examination and then jump into a fellowship. Again, the big thing different between the big benefit of both fellowship and residency that you don't get from taking continuing education, that you go for a weekend type thing, is you don't get the structured mentorship. And I don't care where we're at in our careers, I think all of us can benefit from having some sort of structured mentorship, even if we are 10, 15, 20 years out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Derek, you mentioned something with some fortuitous foreshadowing there, but you said, with the direction that we're heading, right? And with knowing the recommendations from the PT Clinical Education Task Force, do you think that residency should be mandatory, and why or why not?
And that's the loaded question probably right now, and I'm sure that if I have ACAPT or CAPT listeners or other folks listening to this, they're probably going to be keen in on this question here. I'll say this, in a perfect world, emphatically, I think yes. I've seen clinicians who have gone on through residency training versus those maybe who haven't. And not that everyone that goes through residency training is going to be better than everybody that doesn't go through residency training, because there's certain talents that people have, certain soft skills that people have that maybe cannot always be trained. But generally speaking, when I look at those who go through residency, they typically come out as a much stronger clinician. And maybe that's because the person that's willing to do residency at this point, where it is optional, is just by nature going to be a better clinician just because they have that kind of drive and interest. But I think, the key there is in a perfect world. But I think we have a long way to go before we can make that happen. First, and probably the biggest issue is that there's not enough residency options available. I don't know what the most recent statistic is, but I know when I was directing our residency program, the numbers were kind of sad. They were basically, there's only enough residency slots for 1% of the graduates for every year is kind of the number that we were hearing. And so we've got to up the game quite a bit. And I think that there's going to be obviously health systems and organizations and such that are going to be making these residencies a lot more available, and that's going to have to happen, but it won't happen overnight. So I think when that happens, I think that that'll be a big thing. But secondly, we also have to make it so that it is not cost prohibitive. In order to attract the best of the best to the field of physical therapy, which we need that for our own professional images and such, is that we have to stay ahead of the curve in terms of compensation. We have to be able to, have somebody look at PT and not, obviously we're a top 10 profession. I think when you look at either like US News and Forbes and all that, we're always in that top 10, which is great. But in terms of financial compensation, then we have to be a little bit careful because while we are rewarded in more ways than financial, eventually there comes a break point. And in terms of residency, I think that there has to be some way that we make it so that it becomes where it's not cost prohibitive. I think if we can do those two things, if we can make it so it's not cost prohibitive and that we obviously have enough high quality residency slots available to folks, I'm all for it. I think that having that required specialty at the end of your education, moving into residency, similar to a medical model, I think is definitely healthy for our profession. So I do support it, but we do have a lot of work that we've got to do.
Yeah, for sure, Derek. And you bring up a couple of really good, important points there, kind of bringing up the, right now the capacity overall of not being able to accommodate that for everyone right now, but also of course, the issues of cost. And not only that with the residency, but with, DPT programs in general. And, and I definitely agree that those are two of the biggest issues. I mean, that's probably one of my biggest concerns over that from a clinician standpoint. I mean, I would love to do a residency and fellowship as well, but it's also so expensive. And, especially from the debt that someone has from school. And I'm not saying that it's not valuable and such, but, it's definitely something that makes me have to do more research in that as well. Because I mean, if it was more like a guarantee that people would get more from it in terms of from financial, it would be a much easier decision to make. But it's hard. It's a tough one.
Yeah, and I think that the PT Clinical Education Task Force, that they still have a lot of homework to do, but they're going about it the right way. They're not doing this in a sense where they're going to have a 3 years of PT and then 2 years of residency, also that you can make a, sort of not necessarily the strongest of salaries. I think that they're looking at this in sort of innovative ways that they can actually make this happen in a sense. And so, I'll be excited to see what they come up with, and I think that they'll do things the right way, especially I think as we move forward as a profession.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see. And and of course with residency comes the board certification route. And Derek, something that I've heard from people who have taken the OCS and have gone through an orthopedic residency program is that they learned and were tested on evidence that was not based on current up-to-date evidence, or they were learning from only one method. Of course, realizing that this is not saying that that's every person, every program. But I'm curious as to what are your thoughts on this, and what do you think needs to be done on a macro and micro scale to improve this? Of course, if you think it's a problem.
Yeah, I know that when I took my OCS back in 2006, it was probably more of a problem than it is even now, where you had folks who would actually write test questions who would maybe come from a background that was of one type. And especially back in 2006, where research and evidence was much less, or there was much less volume of it. There wasn't anything like a clinical practice guidelines and these sorts of things that, sort of, I think, reduced the unwarranted, or maybe not even necessarily unwarranted, but reduce the variation in practice, which is what clinical practice guidelines do. But I think the big thing that has to happen is that we need to get folks that are up to date and knowledgeable of current literature and evidence on these American Board of Physical Therapy specialty test writing pieces there. So I encourage anybody who is a residency graduate who has their OCS, when those applications come out, to make sure that they are applying for those, because we need some of the young guns in there to write those questions. I do think that research and evidence will help dramatically. I think that the onset of, or the development of, the clinical practice guidelines helps. We don't have enough clinical practice guidelines for every condition, though I think that that is the idea behind JOSPT, is to actually build these clinical practice guidelines, at least for obviously every body region, and then also for a myriad of diagnoses that they would actually cover within that. I think that, and then we have to really tailor the questions to that. And so I think that is probably going to be what is going to help, I guess, a little bit more on the micro level. On the macro level, we need, like I said, just a lot more individuals that are willing to step up and actually apply to be a test writer. It's not necessarily easy. They are very stringent upon who they actually accept. And maybe I don't know if that's the issue or not, because I'm not a test writer and I'm not sure how the process works for the applications. But my hope is that they actually are considering individuals who are more recent in their graduation from PT schools, certainly more recent in residency graduation, and recently achieved their OCS. So that way they can see some of the new material that gets entered in on these exams. It's kind of like, the boards do this. They survey individuals who have been out for 5 years, and so you're getting a little bit more up-to-date clinical practice. And I think that's something along those lines would probably enhance that.
Sure, Derek. And I think you make a couple good points on that. And kind of while we're on the OCS as well, I'm just kind of curious from how it was when you took it. Was there a certain time frame like that they would look at research and say, okay, we're going to use research up to this point to write the current exam, we won't accept anything this year? Or is there a line to what evidence they would use for the current test for OCS?
I have no idea. And I got to be honest with you. I remember taking the test. I remember where I took it at, but I don't remember anything about it other than with the description of specialty practices, which is really just a general outline of the material. And then it's up to you to go in and identify that. I think that when I took the OCS exam back in 2006, if you look at the number of research and publications that were available, they probably didn't have a whole lot to pull from. So there was probably a little bit more expertise involved in those areas. And there's probably a lot more of the biomechanistic type questions and maybe some of the pathoanatomical related questions. In terms of research, I think that there should be something along those lines. Not that anything that's over 5 years isn't necessarily important. Maybe there's some identification of seminal literature that is available out there. But, obviously within orthopedics, we see a big change in things. Obviously more in orthopedics, we see a lot more research on pain sciences and such that maybe isn't getting pulled into what we're thinking about when we test for the OCS and such now. So I think that that's actually a really good place to start and see is what that line might actually look like. I know the guidelines that are published by JOSPT, the attempt is to actually update those every 5 years so that way we can keep those things current as well too. So that's probably a good spot.
Yeah, Derek, what are some questions that a student or a PT considering residency should ask themselves to see if even doing residency is right for them?
Yeah, I thought about this. I've thought about this question quite a bit because I get this from students that are actually getting set to graduate now, or I used to get it as a residency program director. And I think the biggest questions is to ask yourself if you're fit enough to do that would, I think, be one of the questions. And when I say fit, I mean a few levels of fitness. One being physically fit, just so that way you actually feel good about yourself and you actually can think about, taking care of your own self in the process, because residency is obviously challenging. But I think most PTs, we probably fall into that category. But the other two is really the mentally, emotionally, or I guess I should say three, mentally, emotionally, and cognitively fit. After PT school, kind of whooped. People are worn out after having 2.5, 3 years of PT education that, is really quite overwhelming. And so then to jump right into a residency program, I think you have to ask yourself if you're ready for that or not. And that includes basically those areas of fitness. If you are, then I think then go for it. The other piece, obviously, is a little bit more of a actual, I guess, sort of question to ask is if you're financially capable of doing that. And as you've said earlier, as a student coming out, you may have, an exorbitant amount of debt. And depending on the type of residency program, you may be challenged to actually fund a residency along those lines. And so I think that's another question to ask yourself. And then also ask yourself where you're at and from a life status. Are you able to move around the country? Are you able to actually pick up and go somewhere? Or are you having to stay somewhere, relatively stable? A lot of it depends on those things.
Sure. No, I think those are some good points, Derek. And do you think that it also kind of depends on someone's educational background and what they got in school? Like, for example, if someone went to a more ortho-based program, but they have no interest in ortho, they want to do peds, but they really didn't get that high level, do you think it'd be more appropriate then for someone to choose a residency in peds?
Yeah, and even if they, of course, a lot of that is actual and some of it is perceived. If you feel like maybe I got shortchanged a little bit on an area that I was interested in, I think absolutely. And that probably even goes back to just more of a self-awareness of where you are at as a clinician. I remember when I came out of PT school, I was thinking I was more dangerous than good. And I probably came out of a program that wasn't as strong orthopedically as they probably are now. And I think if residencies would have been an option, I would have jumped all over it because I was interested in orthopedics, but I didn't feel like I had gotten a lot of that out of my entry-level educational program. That's probably why I went on the endless pursuits of certificates and other sorts of things.
Sure. And, we had Jeff Moore on the podcast a little bit ago, and he made a great point in terms of really getting able to know yourself. And he even said, like, what a student should even do is ask an upperclassman, maybe who's been out for a few years, and pick their brain about what they feel, what they were strong at with the program being out as a clinician, and what they feel like that they need to improve on. Like, what do you feel like the program prepared you well for, and what didn't? So then you can kind of learn and adjust beforehand, whether that be through a residency or whether that be through CEU. So I thought that was a very interesting and helpful point that he said there.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think, getting to know, and that's where the alumni connections and things like that come into play. A lot of programs will feed into other residency programs and such. And so getting a gauge from individuals that came out of the same program, I think is a great barometer to see where you would be at as a potential resident as a potential clinician.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's say then, Derek, that a PT student, or a PT for that matter, has made the decision and they've thought it through and they're going to do a residency. But of course, every program is so different with different, focus, different faculty. And for that potential resident who's looking into that, where should they go to find out about each program? And how should they go about their research process to get it to be effective researching in that realm?
That's such a great question, and the easy answer is they should go to the ABPTRFE, the American Board of Physical Therapy Residency Fellowship Education website, and so you can link to that through the APTA and through the education side of things. But that only gives you the information and the names, and I think obviously if we move toward a mandatory residency program, it's going to become even more overwhelming. You look at the number of residencies that have started in the last 10 years, it's quite profound. And to be able to research every single one of those individually is obviously a tough thing to do. I do think that reaching out to individuals that are gone through it already, so whether that be an upperclassman in their PT program, I think that's a great start. I think being involved in social media is great. Following people that they know have some good input on those things might end up giving a little bit of information, and following the actual residency programs maybe on social media too, to kind of give them some idea where these things are at. The combined sections meeting, they used to actually have a really nice reception with all the residency programs, but then it got to be so big that they could never have a room with all of the residency programs in. And actually, I think the feedback became almost overwhelming. I think that the big thing though is that looking at maybe narrowing it down to a geographical sense, and then narrowing it down to the type of residency that you may be interested in. Meaning that not every residency program is the same. Some residency programs are going to be heavily clinical, where you're actually in the clinic the whole time, and then you're actually doing the didactic work afterwards, and you may be commanding a little bit higher salary versus, say, a traditional residency model where you're actually in the clinic less and you're actually teaching a little bit more, but because you're in the clinic less, you're probably going to be making less. You may be able to narrow it down from those sort of just general 10,000, 20,000 foot overview pieces there. And then once you find where you're at or where you want to be at, then I think going in and digging in a little bit more detail. And then honestly, emailing, calling the program directors and actually trying to speak to them directly, I think is another great way to get some information and some feedback on that, obviously beyond just even their websites and such. And then the other thing too that I would do is actually ask to speak to a current resident if they're really interested. Once it gets down to that point, speak to a current resident just to get a little bit of information about the program, especially in terms of how much work is going to be involved. And because a resident will actually tell you, because when they're in the midst of it, they're probably going to be pretty honest with you about the amount of material that maybe you're going through and such.
Yeah, that's some good points, Derek. And just out of curiosity, what are some signs or some red flags, some cautionary tales maybe that a residency applicant should look out for that indicates maybe a particular program isn't a best fit for them?
Well, the old school way of listen to your gut is probably a pretty good start. But I think the biggest red flags is, I said a little bit of this on the last question. There are basically two types of residency programs, and then from there there's sort of these subcategories. There's probably generally maybe like a handful of types of residency programs. One is you have a residency program where you are full-time in the clinic, and then you're doing the residency program in the evening, and which many people find are great residency programs. Kind of a program that I directed. But as a clinician, or as an applicant, if you feel like that's just going to be too much, being in the clinic for 35 to 40 hours a week and then doing documentation and then also doing residency on top of that, if you're having that feeling, then that's a red flag for you personally, that maybe you need to look at a different type of residency program that is set up differently, where you're maybe not in the clinic as much. The other thing too, though, is to look at the type of training that is involved. At Duke, we have residency and fellowship programs, many of them, but these are a little bit smaller programs. These are, 1 or 2 residents per program per year versus something that's larger like what we had at Benchmark or Evidence in Motion, where you see large scale programs where the didactic material is offered online and you're getting less of that one-on-one attention. Not that one is better than another, but I think in terms of how you look at it, is that something that you are comfortable with in going after? And I think that requires a lot of research and a lot of introspection as a potential residency applicant to see if one of those is maybe better for you or not. And then again, I think when you talk to individuals who are either residents or residency alums, they may not necessarily give you the this is a terrible program, but I think that you can get a pretty good feel for how they feel about the residency. And if you pick up any of those things, then it may not be the best program for you, which may be a great program for somebody else, but maybe not for that individual.
Yeah, those are some good points, Derek, and I think that definitely helps our listeners. So let's say then, Derek, that they've decided to do a residency, they've done their research, and they're set on the program. All right, I'm going for this program here. I'm going for Duke. How does the application process look like? How does that individual start the process to actually apply to that program?
Well, so the residency applications are now very similar to the PT school applications. There is a centralized application system. It's RF CAS. So instead of PT CAS, it's the Residency Fellowship Centralized Application System. And that's actually a great place to actually also start and look at some of the residencies that are out there. Most or all programs, I think, are now required to actually have their application. If you're an accredited program, which most programs will be accredited or aiming for accreditation, you'll apply through that portal, which is nice because it's very similar to PT school, where you can click multiple programs and identify where you're wanting to apply to. So you can apply to multiple programs. Obviously, you have to pay an application fee for each one of those, but you can apply to multiple programs easily enough. And that's, I think, the easiest place to actually start. And that's where you actually begin the application process.
Interesting. So let's kind of flip the script now and look at the other side of things. As a residency educator, how would you describe the ideal residency candidate?
I love this question, actually. Just to give a little shout out to some of my colleagues at Duke, Dr. Chad Cook, who I think you're going to be having on at some point in the future, and then a few other folks that are part of our program at Duke, are actually looking at applications for PT students, which is different. It's not the same thing as residency to some extent. But one of the things that we're looking at doing is actually measuring some of the soft skills that PTs are probably it's probably more important to look at. Obviously we have to have the cognitive abilities, but it's some of those soft skills, the grit, the tenacity, those sorts of things that I think are the things that are of measure that are becoming even more important. And so when I think about the ideal residency candidate, I look at the candidate that is straight up eager, excited, almost cannot wait, has that level of grit, determination, wants to do this because they want to do something better, not only for themselves, but for their patients and for the profession and such. So I think the ideal candidate isn't somebody that, in fact, I would never even, GPA and performance in PT school, all those things to some extent are important. And I think actually in the RF CAS, you actually do have to put your GPA and such in there, but I never looked at that. I would always look at the character of the individual. I would look at what they've done in PT school, what their motivation is for doing residency. They can see sort of the light at the end of the tunnel that, when they're done with residency training, that's probably more of a stepping stone as opposed to a finality. I think that those are probably the big pieces that make up the ideal residency candidate. Again, somebody that is truly is excited about doing residency training and not doing residency training because they feel like it's just part of the process. I guess that would be the hardest. And the hardest thing about that, though, is that's not easy to measure. And that's what we're looking at with some of our folks that are at Duke. They're looking to find ways to measure those abilities.
Yeah, Derek, I love that you guys are looking at some of that stuff because I know even just getting into PT school, that's kind of something that would have applied to me because I was an English major. My grades weren't fantastic. but I definitely would fit into that gritty category, and just having finished Angela Duckworth's book Grit, I love the fact that there's now kind of a grit and a perseverance scale that we can kind of look at, because man, that means a lot. I think there's some really great candidates out there that have the great soft skills and that are, really eager to work and persevere through it, but maybe they weren't the best students. It doesn't mean they're not going to be successful. So I'd love to see how that turns out with what you guys end up finding over there at Duke.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when I came into PT school, it was a little bit of a downtime for PT, and I think that if I were to apply now, I'm not sure I would get into PT school, but I always joke that I think that I've done okay in my career, and that's kind of the types of individuals that I've gotten to know that are sort of the movers and groovers and the pushers in the profession are the ones that were not the 3.9 GPA super high GRE scores. These are the individuals, like you said, the Angela Duckworth grit tenacity type folks. So the ideal candidate is that individual to me.
Yeah, totally. I think you bring up a lot of good points there, guys. And Derek, first, thanks for, this great discussion on a lot of things regarding residencies from all angles, what they are, should they be mandatory, a little bit more into the OCS in that regard, and kind of talking about from the applicant's perspective about how that works, and even kind of what from the director position that they're more looking for. I think that I learned some good stuff today. And, we like to end each episode with this one question that we ask all of our guests. And the question is, if you could change one aspect of healthcare education, and that could be DPT or other healthcare education related, which aspect would you change, and how would you change it?
Ooh, that is such a great question. You guys got a good one there. For me, I'm always curious about why PT is, we rarely get the seats at the table. We're kind of the unknown entity, and we always kind of complain about that to some extent. We're probably a product of our own doing. And so I think that one of the pieces that I would change in healthcare education is to try to figure out ways that, we can create a sort of a passionate base of physical therapists. The physical therapist that's going to barge their way in and have a seat at the table, whatever that table might actually be. I think it also comes down to more collaborative education models. I think the days of the silo education should be minimized. I think that we should see some sort of cross-pollination and education with other healthcare entities, be that nursing, be it PA, nurse practitioner, medicine, and those sorts of things. And I only say that because of the opportunity that I've had to come at Duke, we're starting to see that a little bit. But even there, we're right there in a major health system, and I think we're still challenged with that. And there's a challenge that we're going to try to make that better. But again, PT has to have some push in that area. So I think if I was to change one thing about PT education is that we would become more of that interprofessional related education and try to leverage more of those opportunities. And that's not just PT and medicine, but PT and nursing, PT and PA and these sorts of things. And I think that's what's going to help change us as a healthcare profession. And then also teaching us ways that beyond just the clinical skills, but also becoming leaders and advocates for our profession and recognizing that importance, and somehow or another, some way injecting that into a PT program, I think is going to be necessary as we move forward as a profession.
Yeah, those are some great points, Derek. I love that aspect of things, and I like to call it kind of interdisciplinary trespassing, right? Where we kind of all learn from each other, we dabble in each field, and we just spread the wealth of knowledge, So I love those takes, man. Where can people find you online and on social media if they have any follow-up for you?
Yeah, well, they can, of course, the website, Duke DPT website. I am on Twitter. I'm not super active, but I'm not inactive. But they can find me there, and they can certainly message me that way. My Twitter handle is DJCLEWPT. And I'm also on Facebook. If you're a PT person, I typically will accept you as a friend because I like to leverage that opportunity as well. But mostly on Twitter is where I'll do more of my professional networking and such. And then you can find me on on the Duke DPT website under the faculty, and you can send me a direct email that way as well. And I'd love, if anybody is listening to this and they're contemplating residency training and such, one of my favorite things to talk about. This has been fun, and I would love to engage individuals that have that want to have that conversation. I'll make time for that to happen. That's something that's important.
Thank you, Derek, for that. I'm sure our listeners will greatly appreciate that, and thank you for all that. And thank you for coming on today. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Oh, thank you guys, man. This is pretty cool. You guys have done a really good job. It's impressive to see this podcast actually grow the way that it has, and it's such an important topic, and I'm really glad you guys are actually putting it out there. It's
awesome,
great stuff.
Thanks. It's been a work in progress ever since, but we're just working little by little and hoping it's reaching some people and providing some value. That's mostly what we're trying to do.
I am sure it is.
Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.